former national security advisor in the Trump administration. Robert, my brother, welcome back. Robert, one of many issues that I wanted to raise with you, Joe Biden's talking about Armageddon. He talked about Armageddon again in this brief interview he had, yesterday, Jake Tapper and so forth. Why is he talking about Armageddon and not talking about how the United States can overcome Armageddon or prevent it in the first place? That's what's kind of got me burned up.
Well, Larry, thank you, and nice to be with you. And it's always great to follow Marsha Blackburn. She's one of the people, I moved out of the swamp like you did after the last administration, but Marsha's one of those people you miss in Washington, so it's nice to follow her as well. And
Indeed.
And good to be with you today. Well, look, this is the problem that we had before the invasion, right? You and I talked about this. We didn't deter Putin from invading his neighbor. And so now there's a little bit of an overreaction to say that if Putin threatens nuclear war, we'll up the stakes again and talk about Armageddon, like this will be the end of the world. What we need to do is get back to deterring the bad conduct, the malign conduct of our adversaries. And the way to do it with Russia is to let the Russians know, if you were crazy enough, if you were malign enough, malicious enough to use a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, and there's no military purpose for it. There's no large concentration of armor that's threatening the Russian Federation. There's no underground nuclear facility like in Iran that you need to use a tactical nuclear weapon to destroy to protect your country. There's no reason to use a nuke in Ukraine other than to kill innocent men, women, and children. And we need to let the Russians know if they tried to do that or if they engaged in that sort of conduct, Russia would be a pariah state and it would be the end of the Russian Federation, at least their economy and their diplomatic relations as they know it today.
How do you make Russia a pariah state?
Well, it's a good question. I think there are three kind of buckets that falls into without getting into the military issue. And the first is diplomatically. I mean, that means every country, if the Russians used a nuclear weapon, a tactical nuke in Ukraine, every country should cut off diplomatic relations with Russia immediately. Pull out of Moscow, don't have an embassy, kick their diplomats out, half of them are spies anyway, kick them out of the UN. Now, it may be hard to do that legally because the Russians have a seat on the Security Council, so they could veto an effort to expel them. But every country that hosts a UN mission, whether it's New York or Geneva or Vienna, could refuse visas for Russian diplomats. So you could effectively, de facto, eliminate the Russians from the UN. That's how you do it diplomatically. Economically, we got to do what you suggested, threatening the Russians with to keep them from invading Ukraine in the first place. And you said this 9 months ago, Larry. You put full sanctions on the Russian Federation Central Bank. Mm-hmm. Don't let them have one oil and gas sale to anyone, not to India, not to China, not to Iran. And any company or any country that deals with them should get hit with secondary sanctions. So you could basically close off the Russian economy from the rest of the world. And then third, we'd have to make it so that Russians couldn't travel. Cut them off from visas to go to Turkey where they like to go on vacation, or Cyprus or Greece, or make sure all the private military contractors, these Wagner Group guys who are running around Africa and Syria, cut them off from traveling outside of Russia. Don't let Russians travel outside of Russia. And then maybe have war crimes trials, even if it's abstentia, against Putin and anyone involved in issuing the order to drop a nuclear bomb or send a nuclear tipped missile to Ukraine. So those are the sorts of things that if the Russians understand that's coming down the track, if they engage in that type of behavior, that keeps them from trying to bully us. We're not going to be bullied by Russia and their nuclear weapons. We weren't in the Cold War. We're not going to be today. And they shouldn't be allowed to kill innocent Ukrainians with either nuclear weapons or conventional weapons.
It's kind of like making them into North Korea. That's what I kind of hear you saying.
Absolutely. A big North Korea.
Yeah, I mean, but the same lack of any international rights. Kick them out of the G20. Kick them out of all these organizations. You're right. Don't let them travel. Yeah. Literally take their money. We never did clamp down on the Russian Central Bank entirely. We never did. That was still an opening. And look, the guy's still making money. OPEC Plus raising prices by cutting back on production. That helps finance them. So I just wish that Biden or his Secretary of State or somebody in there would walk through some of these, true retaliatory measures if Putin acts out with nuclear weapons or tactical nuclear weapons. I mean, I'm tired of hearing Armageddon. To me speaks of weakness, Robert. When I hear him talk about Armageddon and not follow through, you follow what I'm saying? That speaks of weakness, and I hate weakness. I hate weakness anytime, but I especially hate weakness against a place like Russia.
Larry, you and I both know this, and we learned it at Ronald Reagan's knee. At peace through strength works, and weakness in international affairs is provocative. It creates an incentive for adversaries to do the wrong thing. So we've got to be strong. And look, we got to tell the Russians, take a look at Rhodesia in the 1970s. Take a look at South Africa in the 80s and 90s. It'll be that, but it's worse. Well, we can cut them off from postal service, cut them off from telephone service, cut them off from the internet. I mean, all of these things are a privilege to be involved in these international organizations that allow you to participate in the world. If you cross a red line and use a nuclear weapon to kill civilians just because you started a war and lost it, and you tried to conquer your neighbor and your neighbor fought back and gave you a bloody nose, you don't then get to use a nuclear war and a nuclear bomb and blow up your neighbor. And that's just not how things work in the world, and we shouldn't put up with those sort of threats.
Just last 30 seconds, Robert O'Brien. The Russians are now indiscriminately bombing all these places because they're so weak on the ground. What does that mean? How do you see that story? Has it changed anything in Ukraine?
No, because look, these missile attacks on civilians, on playgrounds, and on art houses and theaters and schools, these have no military utility. The Russians are still losing on the battlefield. They're losing, in the northeast. They're losing down around Kherson. None of these strikes are helping them. None of them are military targets that would improve the lot of their soldiers or their position in the war. It's just simply terror. It reminds me of what Hitler did at the end of World War II with the V-2 bombs in Europe and London, trying to demoralize the population to bring them to the negotiating table. I think the Ukrainians are pretty tough. They've shown a brave fighting spirit, and I don't think that Putin's going to break their spirit with this indiscriminate bombing of civilians. And again, the rest of the world just needs to come out very strongly against this sort of malign activity, and also give the Ukrainians the air defenses they need to prevent these strikes from happening.
All right. Former National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien. Thank you, Robert. Appreciate it very much.